All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about NATO, and I also want to talk to you guys about the current zeitgeist that we are living in. It's all very, very surreal, I must say. People are talking about NATO. Is NATO going to be dismantled? Will NATO die? Blah, blah, blah. Well, I have been looking at NATO here and there for a while, and this is what I think about NATO. And my opinion about the EU is similar. I think that NATO, a lot of NATO really is just bullshit. I'm going to say it. Now, I'm going to say it knowing the risk. I know that there is a risk that I will be found with egg on my face. And I know that there is a risk that in the future people will say that I was full of crap. But I'm going to say this anyway, regardless of the risk. I think that NATO is bullshit. Now, why do I say this? Everyone talks about Article 5. Oh, Article 5 says that when one party is attacked, that will be considered an attack on all NATO members, yada, 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 right? Everyone talks about this. Everyone talks about this immense, ginormous, colossal Article 5. Well, let's take a look at Article 5, all right? Now, I spent some time today looking at this, and I read Article 5, and this is what it says. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. So we have here this Three Musketeers effect here, right? One for all, three for one, or whatever the hell it is, whatever the mantra is. And so everyone has heard about this line. This is the line that people repeat. An attack on one party will be considered an attack on all parties. Well, let's continue to read the article. Let's continue to read the paragraph. So this is what it says. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. This is what everyone has heard. This is the mantra. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right or individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, there's a lot of word salad stuff going on here, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary. Whoa, 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 whoa. So everyone's heard of the first part of Article 5, right? If one party is attacked, it will be considered an attack on all NATO members, right? This is the Three Musketeers effect here. And so everyone has heard this. Well, if one NATO member is attacked, oh my God, it's World War III. But there is a loophole. Believe me, they don't write these articles without consulting some legal geniuses who can provide loopholes for them. And this is the loophole. One little line in this whole cacophony of a word salad, in this whole cluster, this whole quagmire of a word salad, there is a loophole. It's this little line right here. Such action as it deems necessary. The parties will take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. So it doesn't say an attack on one party is an attack on all parties, and so therefore all parties will have boots on the ground, guns ready, bullets being fired, guns blazing. All right, that's not what it says. This is not Bad Boys 2, where you have Will Smith and his partner saying, well, if you don't get my daughter in the house by 10:01, we're gonna be locked up, hunting your ass down, locked and loaded. Right? That's not what's happening here. This is not a geopolitical gangster's paradise. This is not a geopolitical mafioso. This is an agreement that these countries have made, and this agreement was designed to scare Russia. And really, let's be real here. What's the whole point of NATO, right? NATO is America's empire, and it's centralized in Europe. That's where the focus of NATO is. It's America's empire controlling Europe, and this is a part of the post-World War system that we have all become accustomed to. And so everyone here thinks, well, if one member gets attacked, that's it. That's not what it says. It says that if one member gets attacked or if multiple members get attacked, the other parties can take such action as it deems necessary. In other words, the other NATO countries, they can take action, but that doesn't guarantee the use of armed force. It does not. And it says, in fact, it says such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. In other words, there are other options that NATO members can take in a conflict. They could deliver weapons. Who knows? They could do some sort of diplomatic action, but it doesn't say that armed force is the necessary action to take by all NATO members. It doesn't say that all NATO members are mandated and obligated to take armed force to protect an attacked party. That's not what it says. And so really, what is the whole point of NATO? You could say, well, it's to scare the Russians. It's to make the Russians think that if they attack NATO, that Russia is going to get obliterated or incinerated. Okay, that's fine. That's a fair observation. But really, I think the main purpose of NATO, or at least one of the major purposes of NATO, is just for big defense companies to make money. You want to have fighter jets? Well, you better buy the American fighter jet. And that's why you see all these NATO countries buying American fighter jets. Greece buys a whole bunch of American fighter jets. But what happened? What happened some years ago? Turkey wanted to buy some American fighter jets, and America said, "Well, Turkey, you want to purchase a Russian S-400, and that is against the rules. So we don't really want to sell you American fighter jets." And Turkey said, "Okay, all right. F you, America. We're going to make our own damn fighter jet." And Turkey is on its way to having its own indigenously made fighter jet in operation very, very soon. And you have Japan also wanting to have its own fighter jet. So what's happening? What's happening is this post-World War II order is crumbling before our eyes. This is what I see. This is what I see. And here is the thing. The general American population has zero interest in fighting a war against Russia. You ask the average American, do you want to, I don't know, put on an army uniform and take up a gun and take up some grenades and go fight some Russian soldiers in the middle of some snowy wilderness somewhere in the middle of nowhere where drones can attack at any moment? The average American is going to say, hell no. The general American population does not give a damn about going to war with Russia. The average American population has zero interest and gives zero figs about fighting against the Russians. And this sentiment is clearly reflected in the election of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump won the popular vote. Donald Trump didn't just win the Electoral College. It wasn't a case where a Republican ran for office and won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. That's not what happened. He won the Electoral College, and he sure as hell won the popular vote. Why is this? Because in the general population of the United States, people do not want to go to war. Hell, we are still psychologically recovering from Iraq and Afghanistan. Hell, in some ways, we are still recovering from Vietnam. We still have Vietnam vets here. And so people don't want to go to war. So here's the thing. If war against Russia is extremely unpopular, which it is, this is going to reflect the American political scene. And you see it already. You see it in the election of Donald Trump. So if, let's say, Russia attacks NATO, let's say Russia attacks Poland, let's say Poland does something to piss off the Russians, I don't know, they put a bunch of troops in Ukraine or something like that, and the Poles say, well, we're going to fight against you, Russia, because we have some great historical hero who fought against the Russians. We are going to honor the name of Pilsudski or whatever the hell his name is, and we are going to fight against you damn Ruskies for all the terrible things that you did to us or whatever. They'll bring up some historical grievances. And so let's say Russia and Poland are at war. what's going to happen? Well, we're going to say, oh, well, look, it's the 17th century all over again. Those Poles and Russians are killing each other. And this is some typical Slavic brotherly tribal warfare. That is a family dispute. This is a geopolitical, dysfunctional family dispute between the Slavic brethren. We don't give a damn. Now, people are going to say, well, Poland is a member of NATO. We have to defend NATO. This is NATO here. We have to defend them. What's going to happen? Do you think the average American is going to give a damn about Poland? No, they don't give a damn about Poland, just like they don't give a damn about freaking Ukraine. So the general opinion of the American population is going to be seen in the political discourse and in the political elections. And you're going to have politicians saying, well, if I want to be popular amongst my voters, I better be anti-war. And that is why in today's zeitgeist, if you are pro-war, guess what? You are not popular at all. You're not popular. This is why RFK is popular. This is why Tulsi Gabbard is popular. This is why Trump is popular, because they all presented themselves as critical of the military-industrial complex and critical of war. We don't want America getting involved in other people's conflicts, and we sure as hell don't want to see American soldiers with boots on the ground in some crazy-ass conflict that has nothing to do with American national security. And so let's say Poland and Russia are at war, or let's say Russia goes to war with some Baltic states. They go to war against Lithuania, and they say, listen, Lithuania, you know, you had a bunch of Nazis in your history, and you still have people in your country who honor Nazis. Or they're gonna do the same thing with Estonia, right? They'll say, you damn Estonians or you damn Latvians, you still have some Nazi sympathizers in your midst, and you guys were Nazis in the past, and you guys are persecuting some Russian minority, etc., etc. We are going to go to war in the Baltics. So let's say that happens. You think the average American is going to give a damn? No. The average American is not going to give a damn, and that will be reflected in the politics. And so what's going to happen in such a case? What will happen if America has zero interest? Well, it is very, very likely in such a scenario that America will look for a loophole. And that's if NATO is still around. That's if NATO is still in operation. They will look for a loophole, and that loophole is found in Article 5. I am no lawyer. I never went to law school, but I can recognize a very simple loophole when I see one, and this is it. Such action as it deems necessary. An attack on one party will be considered an attack on all parties, and therefore, in such a situation, all parties can take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, which means there are other options that NATO parties can utilize other than armed force. And there's your loophole right there. And the same thing can be said, my friends. The same thing can be said for our security pact with the Japanese. And it's interesting, if you look at the security pact between the U.S. and Japan, they also have an Article 5, and it's called Article 5. And this is what it says. Each party recognizes that an armed attack against either party in the territories under the administration of Japan would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger, and here's the loophole, in accordance with its constitutional provisions and processes. So a party in the security pact between the U.S. and Japan, if one party is attacked, the other party can take action in accordance with its constitutional provisions and processes. What would that entail? That would entail going to Congress. That would entail getting the approval of Congress to go to war to defend Japan. And you're going to have all these politicians, and let's say China attacks Japan, right? Let's say that actually happens. Let's say China comes up and says, damn you, Japan, you guys raped our women and when you invaded Nanking back in the 1930s, and you butchered millions of our people back in the 1930s, back in World War II. You are absolute butchers, and you have never apologized, and you continue to this day to deny that you guys even did atrocities, and you guys are messing with our rocks. You know, the Japanese and the Chinese, they have this dispute over some rocks. You can actually look into this. They're called the Senkaku Islands. They're not islands. They're literally giant rocks that are emerging out of the ocean, that are sticking out of the ocean. And so supposedly there's some sort of natural resource there, or whatever. But the Japanese say that the Senkaku Islands belong to them, and the Chinese say no, it belongs to us. And so you have this Asian brotherly, this Asian family dispute over some rocks. And so let's say that the Chinese go to war with Japan. There's going to be a giant argument in the United States about whether or not to actually go to war to defend the Japanese. And do you think the average American gives a damn about protecting Japan? No. The average American does not give a fat flying fig about protecting Japan. You can find some old-timer people who voted for Bush and Dick Cheney, and yeah, they'll say, yeah, we gotta go war, and be like, all right, old man, you go fight them. Or you can find some young NATOist idealists who want to get a job in the UN who will say, yeah, we should go to war. But the general American population is going to say hell to the no when it comes to defending any foreign country for that matter. Even Japan. Japan does not get an exemption in this because the average American doesn't want to go to some Asian country, boots on the ground, to fight some Asians, to deal with some crazy Vietnam-like war. Because if you try to go to war in Japan, you're going to have a whole flood of Chinese soldiers. You'll have 10 million Chinese soldiers, and they're all going to be absolutely crazy. And the Chinese will probably just throw in soldiers into a giant meat grinder, and they won't stop. I mean, they have 1 billion people, and the Chinese are just going to say, all right, we got 1 billion people, a lot of single dudes, because they have, I don't know, 5 men for every single woman in China, and a lot of those Chinese women are getting banged by a bunch of English guys who are in China to teach English, and they don't even speak freaking Chinese. So you got a bunch of horny, sexually frustrated Chinese guys joining the army, and they're like, listen, I got nothing else going on in life. I'm gonna go fight for my country, gonna go fight for some rocks. And the average American is gonna say, what? We're not going to go risk our lives for some freaking rocks. We're not going to go risk our lives so that the Japanese can own some rocks and the Chinese can't own some rocks. To hell with that bullshit. And that will be reflected in the political discourse and in the elections of the United States. And so looking at the security pact here between the Japanese and the Americans, what does it say? Yeah, a party can take action if the other party is attacked in accordance with its constitutional provisions. That means going to Congress. That means a bunch of politicians arguing amongst each other whether or not they should go fight for some rocks. That's what that means. Are we going to preserve our lives, or are we going to fight for the right of the Japanese to play Pokemon? That is going to be the debate. And that's the loophole. In fact, they are Japanese thinkers who know about this. And that's why you have Japanese analysts saying, listen, we really can't trust the Americans. One of these analysts is Jun Kitamura, and this is what Jun Kitamura wrote back in 2020. He said, Article 5 states that the United States must comply with the provisions and procedures of the U.S. Constitution when making a security commitment. In other words, the specific content of military support activities cannot be determined by the intentions of the U.S. government, including the president, who received advice from the military. Ultimately, it will be decided by Congress. This means that the trend of public opinion in the United States will be the biggest factor in determining the content. So, in other words, if you have a bunch of Americans who are listening to RFK for hours, or they're watching, I don't know, Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson all the time, and they're hearing a whole bunch of anti-war stuff, and they don't want to go fight in wars themselves, you're going to have a general American population not giving a fat flying fig about fighting for some sushi stands in Japan so that the Japanese can own some rocks. It's going to be very difficult. And this is the reason why you see the Japanese saying, we got to have our own fighter jet. We have to have our own powerful military. We have to be militarily autonomous and independent. And this is the same reason why you have Europeans saying the same thing, saying we have to be militarily independent. And there is a history of this. Let's look a little bit into history. Let's go back to the administration of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt was president, the Koreans and the Americans had a treaty. They had a treaty that was signed. I'm not entirely sure who was the president when it was signed, but they did have a treaty. And in this treaty, it said something like, if the territory of Korea was under some sort of danger, some sort of threat, that the Americans would act diplomatically to help the Koreans. This is more or less what the treaty stated. And so the Japanese in, I want to say 1905, after the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese and the Russians got into this huge stalemate and they were massive casualties on both sides. Hell, in the Battle of Mukden, 60,000 Russians were butchered. In just one battle, 60,000 Russians. I mean, it was insane. The Americans were looking at this war between the Japanese and the Russians, and they said, this is great. Look, the Japanese are defeating our Russian enemies. And the American government under the Roosevelt administration, Theodore Roosevelt administration, was very happy, and they were also very pro-Japan because they thought that they could use the Japanese as a proxy against the Russians and the Chinese. And so what happened after the Russo-Japanese War was that the Japanese were going to fully take over Korea. Now, the Japanese were already in Korea to some extent, but they really wanted to just do an absolute direct invasion of Korea. So the government of Korea at that time wrote a letter to Theodore Roosevelt saying, please help us. You guys really have to help us because the Japanese are going to take over and we are under a treaty in which you are obligated to help us. And do you know what Theodore Roosevelt did? Nothing. He didn't do a damn thing. In fact, he wanted the Japanese to take over Korea. In fact, the United States withdrew all of their soldiers from Korea, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Americans got all of the Europeans who had soldiers in Korea to withdraw their soldiers as well out of Korea, leaving the Koreans utterly helpless and utterly susceptible to a Japanese invasion. And what happened was the Japanese invaded Korea, and the Japanese did a whole bunch of atrocities, not surprisingly. And that's what happened. And so the Americans screwed over their Korean ally, and they empowered the Japanese. And also, when the Japanese and the Chinese went to war in the first Sino-Japanese War from 1994 to 1995, the reason why the Japanese were able to defeat the Chinese was because the Japanese were modernized. They had the Western technology that gave them the advantage over the Chinese. And what really advanced the Japanese, what really got the Japanese to have that Western technological innovation was the fact that the Americans forced the Japanese to absorb Western technology, ushering in the Meiji period of Japanese history. And so the Americans really were the ones who armed the Japanese. They were the ones who introduced the Japanese to Western military technology, empowering the Japanese. The Americans enabled the Japanese to invade Korea, screwing over their Korean ally. And so really, the Americans contributed greatly to the empowerment of Japan. Now, what happened eventually? Regardless of all that history, regardless of the fact that the Americans were pro-Japan, regardless of the fact that the Americans thought that they could use the Japanese as a proxy against the Russians, regardless of all of this, what happened in the end was the reverse of what people may have thought. What happened in the end was, well, you had World War II, and the Americans sided with the Russians against the Japanese. And after World War I, the Americans were very worried about the rise of communism, the rise of Bolshevism. And so after World War I, the Americans deployed a whole bunch of troops into the Soviet Union. And that was really, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was the closest thing that we have gotten to a direct conflict between Americans and Russians, if I'm not mistaken. And so you had all these American troops in the Soviet Union. And then eventually the Japanese deployed a whole bunch of troops into the Soviet Union, into Russia, and the Japanese, in fact, deployed the highest number of soldiers into Russia after World War I. And then what happened was the Americans eventually withdrew, but the Japanese said, no, we're going to stay. And what that was about was Japan flexing its muscles because the Japanese really wanted to go to war with the Russians. And so you would think, okay, you have the Americans who are against Bolshevism, and the Japanese are an ally, and so if there is another war in Europe and Russia is involved, you would think that the Americans would have gone to war against the Russians, but that's not what happened. The Americans, as we all know, allied with the Russians against the Japanese and against the Germans. Now, before World War II, there were a lot of Americans and British people who admired Adolf Hitler, and they also admired fascism. In fact, Winston Churchill admired fascism, and he believed that fascism could be used as a weapon against the rise of Bolshevism and against communism. Those are pretty much the same thing. And so he thought that the fascists were actually beneficial. And what eventually happened was what? The British fought against the fascists. They fought against the Nazis. The Americans, there were a lot of Americans who admired Adolf Hitler. You had some big American industrialists like Mr. Ford. You had another American industrialist like Sostenes Ben, difficult name to pronounce, who also wanted to empower Hitler. Of course, these people wanted to make money, but they also admired Adolf Hitler. And there were also people in Wall Street who supported Nazism. And a lot of these people, and I want to say all of these people actually, were hardcore eugenists, and they really had an ideology that paralleled with Nazism in the sense that they had nationalism, eugenics, social Darwinism, all that stuff. And so you had this support for Nazism in the United States, but what eventually happened? What eventually happened was the reverse of what some people may have thought at that time. The Americans sided with the communist Russians to fight against the ultranationalist Germans. And so what do we see today? We see the Europeans saying we can't really trust the Americans, and they've been saying this sort of thing for a while. You can go back to Angela Merkel in 2017, and also I want to say in 2018, in which she said that the days of Germany trusting the Americans are pretty much over. And then we see Mr. Friedrich Merz, who's going to be the next Chancellor of Germany, saying effectively the same thing, that he doesn't really trust the Americans. He definitely does not trust the current American administration. So Germany needs to make its military powerful again. And so what are we seeing here? We are seeing the Japanese also saying this sort of stuff, that we need to be more militarily autonomous. In fact, the Japanese have even talked about creating their own Asian NATO, and the Americans said, hold on there for a second, don't do that. But what is this? This is a sign of these big power blocks that are supposed to be a part of this post-World War II system, wanting to break away and create their own blocks of influence, their own spheres of influence and power. And so the Japanese are saying we want to make our own thing. The Europeans are saying we want to make our own independent militaries. We want to make our militaries independent of the United States. And the Germans are saying what? I mean, what did Olaf Scholz say some years ago? He said that Germany must be the defender of Europe, meaning that Germany must be the most powerful country in Europe militarily. Germany is already the most powerful country in Europe economically, but Germany wants to be the most powerful country in Europe militarily. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about really the breakdown of NATO in a way. I mean, this is at least what I'm seeing here. So let's say we have this rise of Germany, and Germany has this giant military, and they have all these European auxiliaries backing it. What are the Americans going to do? Because the Europeans are more concerned about Russia than we are. We are in between two oceans. What happens in Europe doesn't necessarily even have to affect us. It would affect us because we live in a global world, but if America went completely isolationist, America could survive pretty well. I mean, we have oil, we have tons of farmland. America would survive. But the Europeans have more stake in the game, or more skin in the game. The Europeans are right next to Russia. Germany is right near Russia, borders with Poland, right near Ukraine, it borders with France. And plus you have this very, very long history of very bloody conflict between these European countries. So the Europeans are way more concerned about Russia than the Americans are. So what's going to happen? I see the rise of a revived German power with European auxiliary forces. I also see the rise of Japan. I also see the rise of Turkey, and we are currently seeing this. And I also see a Germano-Turco alliance being made in the future. This is what I see. Now, back in World War I, the Turks and the Germans were allies. You can go all the way back to the beginning of Germany as an official country under Bismarck, in which one of the first things that Germany did as a new nation was create an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. This was under Bismarck. Bismarck hated Polish people. He wanted to exterminate all Polish people, but he didn't. And this was eventually attempted by Adolf Hitler. So you see this same spirit of German supremacy from Bismarck, and then you see it getting translated or getting shifted over into Hitler and continuing on. So you have this history of warfare, and you have this history of Germany being this dominating force in Europe. You can go back to World War I, World War II. Germany was a dominant force in Europe, the dominant force in Europe, against the British, against the French, against the Russians. And you can even go back to the 30 Years' War, and you will see that most of the battles that happened in the 30 Years' War took place in Germany. So Germany has always been this center of war in Europe, at least in the modern period. And so if you have this revived German power, that's going to be a threat to the Russians. It is. It's going to be a threat to the Russians, given the history. And you also see the British trying to flex their muscles. They're saying, oh, we're going to have a coalition of the willing, which harkens back to Bush saying that we have a coalition of the willing against Saddam Hussein. So I don't know exactly what they're going to do with that. But the British are also trying to flex their muscles. And are the British going to ally with this revived German power? That's another question. I see that going in one of two ways. Either the British are going to side with this big German power, or they're going to not side with it and get closer to the Americans. And that's what happened in World War II. The Americans and the British were allies against the Germans. But here is why Germany has to be really at the center of any sort of revival of European militarism. It has a lot to do with, well, there's several factors. One, Germany is a very industrial country. Germany is a very innovative society. Germany is I'll just put it this way. Germany has a history of being very warlike, and that is clearly an understatement. But Germany has a lot to do with militarism because of its location. I mean, it's right there in the center of Europe. It borders with Poland. It borders with France. It's right next to Denmark, the Netherlands. It's right next to Scandinavia. It's right there at the center of Europe. So if you have a major revival in European militarism, you best believe that Germany is going to be involved in that. And if you have a bunch of European countries who want to go to war with Russia, you best believe that Germany is going to be a part of that. And like I said before, Olaf Scholz said that Germany must be the defender of Europe, which means that Germany must be the most powerful country militarily. So what I'm foreseeing is revived German power in an alliance with a revived Turkish power. So I'm seeing a Turco-Germanic alliance alongside allies of Turkey, allies like Azerbaijan, and also allies of Germany, so Germany's European auxiliaries. And so in such a situation, eventually you're going to be at this point where you're going to have this Turco-Germanic power versus Russia. And what are the Americans going to do at that point? Are they going to say, okay, Germany and Turkey are NATO allies, and we are obligated under Article 5 to save them? The thing is that Americans don't care. Now, there could be a situation where Americans do reverse their sentiments and become pro-war against the Russians. That is a possibility. I mean, reality will always shock us in the end. But the only way I see that happening is if there is a giant terrorist attack happening in the United States and then they blame it on the Russians. I mean, that's the only way I see that happening. I'm talking about like a major 9/11, but Call of Duty style. It's the whole no Russian level and that very controversial video game years ago. I'm talking something like that, but a situation where you'll have droves of Americans being slaughtered, and perhaps the gunmen will actually be Ukrainians who can speak Russian, but then the U.S. Media complex will say this was an attack by the Russians, blah blah blah, and then they have all the videos, and then you have enough pissed off Americans who would say, okay, let's go to war, right? I could see that happening, but even in that situation, war would still be a hard sale because of the prominence of conspiracy theories on the internet, especially now with X. And you would have in such a situation plenty of Americans saying that this is a false flag attack and this is just some Gladio, NATO, CIA operation to get us to go to war and it's bullshit, etc., etc. So even in that situation, war would still be a hard sell. So what are the Americans going to do in a situation where you have a Turco-German alliance versus Russia? I see the Americans doing one of either three scenarios. One is America does nothing. That's one scenario. That's one possible scenario. Another possible scenario is that America joins this Turco/European alliance against Russia. Or the third possible scenario is America joins the Russians, like it did in World War I and World War II. So those are my thoughts on that. And I've talked long enough. There you go. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.